Let's start working on submitting this recipe now. Let's give the recipe form an ID of recipe form. Above this form, let's add a status div with the ID of recipe status. We'll use this div to display a message to the user whether or not the recipe was submitted successfully. Open up the main.js file. This is the same file that should contain the rating submission. Let's listen for the form submission using the on method. We'll be given an event object. We're going to call the prevent default method so the form isn't submitted. We want to use Ajax for submitting the form. We're going to hide the form during submission so the user doesn't submit the form twice. Next, we're going to select the status div and add some HTML. Add a waiting message. I'm going to wrap this around some Bootstrap markup to make it look good. Just like last time, create an object that will contain the form values. To grab the values, you simply select the input fields by their IDs and use the val method to get the value. For the action, we'll set this to submit user recipe. Grabbing the content from the editor is pretty simple. When we included the editor, WordPress also loaded the tinymce object. We can grab the content by using this object and grabbing the current active editor and call the getContent method, which will return unsanitized HTML. Lastly, we submit this data using jQuery's post method. Remember that the recipe object is available to us and we can reuse it to provide the Ajax URL. Inside the response function, we'll be doing either one of two things. We're going to check the data object for a status property and check if its value is equal to 2. If it is, then we know that the form submission was a success. Otherwise, an error occurred. I'm going to update the status HTML appropriately. If the submission was a failure, I'm going to show the form again. Let's handle the form submission now. Inside the main plugin file, let's add the action hook WP Ajax. We have to append our action to this hook, like so. The function we want to call will be the same name as the action. I'm also going to make this hook available for guests, as I'm going to allow for guest submissions too. Inside the process folder, create the file called submit user recipe.php and define the function here. We'll need to include this file from the main plugin file as well. Create a variable named output. This will be an array that will contain the status. Set the status to 1. I'm going to perform a very simple check on each input. I want to know if any of the fields being submitted are empty. If they are, I'm going to send back the output with the WP send JSON function, which will kill the script. After this, I'm going to paste in some code. Pause the video if you need to. All I'm doing here is sanitizing the input. Keep in mind that most of our fields are metadata, so we create the recipe data array just like last time. For the most part, I'm using the sanitize text field function to sanitize the input. However, we can't use this function for sanitizing the content. Instead, I'm using a function called WP KSES_post. In the resource section, I provide a link to a function called WP KSES. Let's take a look at this function in more detail. There are a few libraries out there in PHP that help with sanitizing HTML. WordPress provides its own solution, which is the preferred method for sanitizing HTML. The WP KSES function is pretty flexible as it allows us to define what HTML tags are allowed along with what attributes and protocols are allowed. It would be pretty time consuming to have to re-enter what HTML is allowed every time we use this function. If we scroll down, there's a link to the WP_KSES post function. This function does the exact same thing as WP_KSES, but instead uses the same filter for posts. This function saves us some time. Since our recipe post is basically just a post, it makes sense to just use this shorter function. If you prefer to define your own set of HTML and attributes, then I suggest using the WP_KSES function. All our data is now sanitized and ready to be inserted into the database. Inserting a post is actually really easy. We don't even have to use the global WP_DB object to perform this task. WordPress provides a handy function called WP_InsertPost. I'll provide a link to this function inside the resource section of this lecture. This function will insert a post for us and even take care of sanitization just in case we forget to do so ourselves. There's only one parameter, which is an array of arguments. There are numerous things we can set, but we won't be using all of them. The only required arguments are the content and the title. If we skip anything else, WordPress will fill the rest by default. This function will end up returning the ID of the post created, which we will need for adding post metadata. Create a variable named post ID, and its value will be the value returned by the WP_InsertPost function. Pass in an array, and we're going to define the following arguments. Post content will be set to the content variable. Post name and post title will both be set to the title. The difference between these two is the name is used for the slug, and the title is used for the actual human readable title. Post status will be set to pending. By default, this is draft. We don't want to publish this recipe. Post type will be set to recipe since that is our post type. That's it. Feel free to read over the codex and set the rest of the arguments if you would like to customize this further. Next, let's call the update post meta function to set the recipe data metadata. Our function is almost finished. All we need to do now is update the status in the output array to 2 and then output it using the WP_SendJSON function. Refresh the form page and try submitting the form with no input. You should get an error. Now try filling out all the fields and we should see a success message. You should also have your console open to check for any errors. If you've received no errors and received a success message, then there's one last thing we need to check. Go to the recipe admin page and see if the post has been added. After confirming that it's available, let's view it in our editor, and as you can see, everything was inputted correctly, including the metadata. This is exactly what we wanted. We now have a form where users can submit their own recipes.